Hello, this is John Threadgold here, and this is my second video in response to psychological disturbance. Is it as simple as ABC? I don't have time to deal with all the points that have been raised with my first video, but I do want to complete my exploration of the causes of psychological disturbance that don't involve ABC. And I want to look at three things really. One is the fight, flight and freeze mechanism in relation to hospital operations and how that can be a source of psychological disturbance. I want to look at fight, flight and freeze within the context of our life histories. And I also want to look at how core beliefs actually can cause psychological, or can be instrumental in causing psychological disturbance, in that they prevent us from experiencing what I call legitimate suffering. So it's a bit of a tall order in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try. So the first thing that I want to say is or rather to recommend, is a really excellent book by Peter Levine called Waking the Tiger. Now in this he shows how, for example, people can go into hospital without experiencing any trauma symptoms. Say they can be anaesthetised perhaps for a tonsillitis or for some other operation, and they can come out of that hospital feeling traumatised. Now this is nothing to do, in my view, with thinking. What happens is that rationally we know that the operation is there perhaps for our own good. We know that, but the more primitive parts of the brain, what we call we have a tripartite brain. We have a sort of reptilian brain that resembles the brains of reptiles. We have a mammalian brain that resembles that of mammals, and then we have a highly advanced neocortex that involves thinking processes as well as some emotional processing. But what happens is that while we're in the operation, the fight, flight and freeze mechanism can indeed be triggered, and this is because the more primitive parts of the brain interpret the experience that we're going under as an attack on the body. Rationally, of course, we know that it isn't, but experientially, that isn't what happens. And here we have an example of energy being released. There are constraints on the discharge of that energy, and people can therefore come out of hospital actually experiencing trauma symptoms that they've never experienced before. And that's an illustration, if you like, of fight, flight and freeze, and it's also a major undiagnosed cause of psychological disturbance. Now, just in case, I know that Dr Pucci talked about, I think, thoughts, certain things were thoughts. Can I just briefly say that my definition of thinking, I wouldn't classify them as thoughts. My definition of thinking is where you take experiencing, where you then use language to symbolise that experiencing. Language then, through the synthesis of language and experiencing, we have conceptual meaning, we have propositional statements about inner reality in the world in which we live, and we also use logic. So it's a process. That process, as I understand thinking to be, is not involved in the example that I just gave. It's a physiological reaction to a life situation. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is fight, flight and freeze within the context of our life history. Let's assume that a woman walks in with depression, anxiety and panic attacks, and in talking to her we discover that she was emotionally abused by her father. Now, emotional abuse of various types can indeed have lasting psychological consequences. Now, what actually happens here is that when she's responding to her father, or when he's responding to her, let's assume, for example, that he's shouted at her frequently, that he's called her useless and stupid, that even simple things like taking a drink will be described as "you selfish little bitch," etc. All real stuff. And what's happened is that there's quite a complex thing. The body itself, shared with the animals, has a fight, flight and freeze mechanism. But just as in the operation, that fight, flight and freeze mechanism and the energy, the huge amounts of energy that are produced by the body are not discharged because there are constraints. And there is therefore a body memory of those incidents and the context within which those feelings, sensations, feelings and energy were actually produced. Now, in addition to that, she may have internalized the memory, the statements of her father, so she now thinks of herself very negatively. She's produced, in what we call, in person-centered, we'd call a self-construct. In CBT, I think you'd more emphasise the core beliefs, and so there is a core belief, if you like, I'm useless, I'm stupid, I'm selfish, I'm really no good. But underlying the core belief is the blocked energy of the fight, flight and freeze. It's not a result of the thinking, it's a result of a physiological process that's been blocked. In addition to that, there will also be particular behaviour patterns. Those behaviour patterns, some of those behaviour patterns will be automatic, like freezing for no apparent reason. Some of those behaviour patterns will be learnt, such as maybe withdrawing from men. Now, this is what we call a structure-bound process that then, in focusing we call it that gets triggered. It's an automatic pattern that involves cognitions, blocked energy and behaviour patterns. And what happens is that when people, say, remind her of her father, or when there's an inner mood swing that triggers it, she's not responding in the here and now to the person who reminds her of her father. What she is responding to is a structure-bound way that is related to the past incidents. So this then is a major cause of emotional psychological disturbance. A further cause of psychological disturbance, very, very briefly because I'm running out of time, is the refusal to experience legitimate suffering. For example, I've had clients who have experienced multiple losses in terms of relationships. People haven't died, but they've just lost those relationships. They have believed, Pentecostal Christians, they believed that, internalised from the church teaching, that they shouldn't be experiencing any suffering at all, and that this refusal to complete a legitimate process has indeed led to immense psychological disturbance. So these are like three examples of how psychological disturbance is caused other than through the ABC mechanism, and I think that they're all legitimate. Last but not least, Siegel, Williams and Teasdale, in their book Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy for Depression, also show that it's not thinking necessarily that triggers emotional feelings or negative feelings, but low mood swings and negative feelings can actually also be a trigger of negative thinking patterns. So they, say, well, they accept the ABC theory, but they also say the ABC theory can be reversed as well. So that's also something to consider when teaching ABC. I really have run out of time, so I'm now going to stop the video.